It was a bit funny when Marta asked me to give a presentation. The question was something in the line of, would you like to give a presentation about intrinsic motivation? So I was thinking about this question. So yes, do I want to give a presentation about intrinsic motivation? Do I really like that? Do I enjoy it? I noticed that a bit of anxiety took over, and I couldn't really feel the intrinsic motivation I could potentially experience doing this presentation. So that was already interesting with respect to the topic of this presentation. And I also, want to invite you to just take a little bit of time and space and reflect and sense what intrinsic motivation is according to your experience. So not so much according to a particular theoretical perspective, but what do you experience? When do you experience intrinsic motivation? And what kind of physiological experiences go along with intrinsic motivation? Do you remember a moment where you were intrinsically motivated intensely? What were you doing? Just to invite you a little bit to go to what we call interoceptive awareness of the state of intrinsic motivation, the experience of it, because I think that's one of the most important things that we can do when we try to create an educational setting for others, is to be mindful of what we're actually creating. And one of the most important information that we can use to be mindful of what we're creating is using our bodily feedback. That actually gives us a lot of insight into what we want to create and what we want to facilitate for the other person. So intrinsic motivation as a topic also reminded me of another question Marta asked me a little while ago when we created an interview for the Buckminster College. And she posed the question something in line of, what have you unlearned in the meantime after school? And my immediate intuitive response to that question was, I've unlearned extrinsic motivation. So that was really clear to me, that was the thing that I've learned in the meantime after leaving school. And that really sort of, it struck me, because I thought, oh, that's such a pity really, that there was that apparently there was not so much, or maybe any of the intrinsic motivation that I clearly have, which is part of the, what I'm doing nowadays, that it wasn't really addressed in the school education. And so thinking about that, and also listening to the presentations that were given last time when Sasha, I think, shared a lot of images of the wild, a pack of wolves, a buffalo with a couple of lions. I thought about intrinsic motivation as something that should be a bit of untamed. So I reframed it into untamed intrinsic motivation that I was looking for while thinking about education, gamification, and intrinsic motivation. And that also reminded me of a phrase that Winner used with respect to gifted persons having potentially a very high intrinsic motivation, and sometimes also showing what he called the rage to master. So when do we see this rage to master? I think so. First of all, what I referred to in the beginning, I think it's really important for instructors, teachers, mentors, anybody thinking about this, is to first reconnect with this experience. When did you experience intrinsic motivation, and what is the bodily experience of it? Then, when do you recognize it? When you see somebody that is intrinsically motivated, how does that appear? What do you notice? I think one of the interesting things is when we see somebody being intrinsically motivated, we see that person seems to be interested in beauty, in truth, in justice for itself. The person is drawn to these kinds of questions that are related to beauty, truth, and justice. And we also get a sense that what we see is a great aesthetic experience. So when you see a person involved in something that feels intrinsically motivated, you see the beauty of that person, and you see also the potential of that person to discover truth and to show truth to what he or she is doing. So intrinsic motivation is also related to what we call transcendence, an experience in which we experience unity, synergy, something that really makes us forget about ourselves and really being involved in what we're doing and transcending ourselves, so to speak. So of course it's a bit complex, intrinsic motivation, because we have many different needs that are oftentimes also simultaneously demanding our attention. But we can try to find some sort of order in it to see how intrinsic motivation might arise. An interesting way of looking at it from a theoretical perspective is something that is, or let's say, a redesign of the Maslow's motivation theory by Scott Barry Kaufman, which he published recently last year. And here we see the metaphor of the sailboat with different human motivations. We see the safety needs, which by Maslow's work named the deficiency needs, and we see the growth needs. And something to keep in mind, I think, as instructors or somebody creating education, is that those safeties or security needs are very important. So whenever they are frustrated, our attention is also easily focused on the fulfillment of these needs. And when we're talking about creating education for adolescents, we can also keep in mind that if these adolescents may grow up in a situation that they're chronically frustrated on a security level, there's a great chance that the perception of the reality of their perception of reality is very much influenced by this frustration, and they will be focused on fulfillment of these needs. That will go along probably with low self-esteem, with a short-term focus, and not so much mental space left for play, for exploration, for actually those growth needs that we see here in the sailboat. Now, of course, we could create a situation that even when these adolescents would not have the mental or emotional space for intrinsic motivation, that we try to control them to get them to be motivated. But the thing is that when you try to do that, you also see that what people create and what they create as a response to these controlled motivation are shortcut answers, and you often do not see the best of the people. So here we see a matrix, which of course I will not explain fully due to the time, that shows how gifted adolescents can be motivated, but actually can also be fully demotivated. And what kind of consequences there are when they are fully demotivated, and what kind of approach is important. So adolescents, of course, can be motivated, but often aren't. And as I said, it has a lot to do with the frustration of these basic needs that I just mentioned. So when they're motivated, but you will see that they probably had some bad experiences with teachers or disappointment in relationships, but there is room for the development of autonomy. And it's also important to provide them the room for this autonomy and to coach them towards some sort of talent development. Yet, if we look at the fully demotivated adolescents, you will probably see somebody that has a long experience of pressure, boredom, sense of utility, lack of connectedness. And that is somebody that really needs a lot of space to recover. Activities aimed at restoring self-esteem, restoring confidence through mirroring by like-minded peers and reliable adults. So just to give you a little bit of sense and feeling of what is important for to actually appear motivated, because this is also something that happens a lot in education, that the feedback towards an adolescent is, well, he or she doesn't appear to be motivated. Well, of course, the person is motivated because the person is alive, so it's motivated, but you need to pose the good question. So what do you really need? So this, I think, is really important to keep in mind. So then we can look at what Daisy and Ryan called autonomous motivation, which is thus not the controlled motivation. And there are different types, and several types. The external regulation does have an influence. For example, introjected regulation is about self-esteem that is dependent upon behavior. Somebody does something out of guilt or out of shame. Identified regulation is about somebody that actually consciously values certain goals that were posed externally, but there's not a direct enjoyment. So the person does recognize that the goal has a value for him or herself, the person does it, for example, learning English, but it doesn't really per se create a lot of enjoyment in the moment. And integrated regulation, which is also posed by the environment, but the person has had a careful exploration and said, okay, this is congruent with my value system. So there's a full assimilation of these goals into the system of the person, so to speak. And then you have intrinsic motivation. So somebody does something for its own sake, for the interest and enjoyment there is to it, which also relates, I think, to what Maslow calls the B values of truth, justice, and beauty that I referred to before. So here we have another picture from the wild. This is my daughter and my partner. We have this little ritual at our home that we dance every day, and as you can see, she enjoys it a lot. And of course, there is a lot of play at our home nowadays, and it's really Lynn, our daughter, that guides us in this play. And I think that's really an interesting aspect of play. That she is a really strong influence on the way we play and what we do throughout the day. Even though, of course, we provide the structure and we provide the environment and all these kinds of needs that are important for her. So play is very important because through play, she experiences boundaries, she experiences risks and risk-taking, she experiences forms of aggression without high levels of stress. And she gets to know her bodily self, the other, us, of course, the environment. She learns how to be a successful, childlike adult, so to speak. And what Saifan referred to in the other presentation 2 weeks ago, I think it's a really nice way that through which humans, in particular humans, play for a very long time and ideally their whole life, that they think through space, they think through motion, emotion, and touch. You really see this going on continuously when a child plays. And this develops into what we call the potential later on to play also with abstractions and to play with complex schemas of the world, which creates yet again the potential for what Weaver called, let's say, a Renaissance-like development, somebody that can be a generalist and a specialist at the same time. So what is really interesting is that, as I said, a child really is quite autonomous in the creation of these sort of play-like interaction. And one of the things we really have to learn being a parent is to follow her attention. So we provide a semi-structured environment, but we follow her attention. And so to speak, we let Lynn, our daughter, guide us. And I've noticed that's not so easy to do because, of course, I have all my own needs and I have all my own goals. So that can become quite frustrating. And I also have all these ideas about how a day should be, about what she should learn, about what she should do. So I have to regulate myself a lot to not to say no all the time, for example, because just saying no all the time would also interfere with her development of, what can I do with this environment? Who am I really? What is this world about? So as a parent, it's quite a challenge, but I think it's quite similar to the challenge that a teacher has or an instructor has. So it made me think about this quote, "Thought is only a flash between two long nights, but this flash is everything," as I read on the website of School of Thinking. And I think it's really an interesting quote if we change thought into attention. Attention is only a flash between two long nights, but this flash is everything. And this is something that I really learned while being a parent. So what about the architecture of education then? What kind of education do we want to create? Some inspiration can come from the self-determination theory again, because DC and Ryan state, okay, so for motivation to arise, for intrinsic motivation to be there, 3 basic psychological needs are very important. Autonomy, competence, and relatedness. They foster the motivation. So it's important for those creating education to take the perspective of the adolescents in this case. So what is their world about? How is their attention regulated, right? So can we follow their attention, yet provide some sort of stimulants and facilitate an environment indeed that also leads to learning processes, but can we also, well, do that, take their perspective and see what they're interested in? To create such a situation, it's important to provide choice and responsibility for their own actions, to provide the environment which they indeed can explore and in which self-initiation is indeed possible and also positively facilitated, so to speak. Then the next aspect that's really important is that the task that they do is quite complex. Of course, not too complex, because that would create a lot of anxiety, but it has to be quite challenging also to match the skills that the person has. And you have to provide enough informational feedback so that the person can learn actually, okay, there's progression going on here. And even though it's difficult, I know I have an amount of control that leads to the experience of flow and also more persistence. Now, yet again, to think about those different human needs that there are, and you have to keep in mind, a very important aspect of this kind of education is also to create social interaction that fosters care and safety. So contact with like-minded peers and also a sense of stableness in the relationship, continuity. If we create this, we will see that quality will go over quantity, and you will see personality traits arising, such as openness to experiences, and also important, I think, conscientiousness. So one way of doing that is through storytelling, because that provides a lot of emotional motivation, like Herwig said. And I think that storytelling also creates a situation where a student has a lot more has better comprehension of what is shared, and feels also the meaningful rationale behind something, what you're doing. So when you create a game, it's also very important, of course, what's the story in that game that is being told? What kind of persona are you in that game? And how do you relate now to that persona? What kind of identity development is actually possible within this story? And this is also something that is very important for adolescents, because it's part of their process, actually, you know, of that kind of, being between 12 and 18 years old. Identity development is a very important aspect. I think with respect to storytelling, another thing that we can keep in mind is that a teacher has a great influence when he or she is inspirational. So not so much being the source of knowledge, but much more affecting the student in a positive way. So if you think about teachers that had a good influence, you probably and I ask you, okay, why was that? Why do you think about this teacher when I ask you about somebody that has a big influence? It was probably because that teacher was inspirational to you. And that inspiration as a source of motivation, but also as a source of, hey, I can play around with the content, I can actually explore and self-initiate, is a really important source. So perhaps even more important than the knowledge that you have.
2 more minutes.
So another phrase that I really liked that was used in I think it was Iwona's presentation, that she said that the self has to speak up to gain authority, and that a person can learn that in a group situation where there's not so much structure, if I remember it well. And I think that's really important for adolescents also. So there is where the autonomy actually develops. And when that happens, a person also senses that there's a great possibility that there's contradiction within the person. And that's okay, because what we notice then is the complexity of the person. The confusion is normal, and it's part actually of what is playful also. It's part of experiencing the risks, experiencing some sort of trespassing of boundaries, but without those high levels of stress. And actually, that's also the best way to cope with anything else in your life. So, and eventually what we'll hopefully see is that you see the person in such an environment, you will hopefully see that they will have this rage to master, and that they perhaps will show also what Csikszentmihalyi calls the autotelic personality, somebody actively seeking challenges. So even if you don't even provide those environments, that they actually have noticed what their intrinsic motivations are about, that they know what kind of bodily feedback gives them insights into the value and the process of a project, that they are mastery oriented, and that they have integrated a form of reflection and monitoring that goes on and helps to create vision and to accept, okay, can I do this? What do I still have to learn? Creating metacognition to go on with the learning process. And what you then see is the development of personal meaning, which is also then related to often to a certain talent domain or several talent domains, and that actually can result in that rage to master, that tremendous motivation and persistence that we sometimes see with gifted students. I think that is what is. Thanks for listening.